They're hiring workers, but they're not regulated. They're not making sure that they're safe. They're not making sure that they're being paid properly. That's another thing, wage theft.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Chandra Childers, who is a senior policy and economic analyst for EARN at the Economic Policy Institute. Chandra, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Really excited to have you. This report came out some time ago, but it's always timely to talk generally about the Southern economy, especially on a Southern Union Talk radio program. So let's start there. Tell us, what is the Southern economic model?
Okay. First, I would like to say, the first report in this series, it's actually a project that's ongoing, and we're releasing pieces to document all of the claims that we make. We want to bring empirical data to bear and to document that. And so the Southern Economic Development Model, or what we're calling the Southern Economic Development Model, it's an economic development model that's characterized by low wages for workers. It's characterized by, and these are intentional policies put into place. It's characterized by little to no regulation on businesses. It has a regressive tax system. It is staunchly opposed to unions because unions empower workers and break down the racial hierarchies in place across the region. And you see lots of subsidies to businesses. And so those are some of the key components of the Southern Economic Development Model. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of those.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely be doing that. And one of the things that you mentioned there was the anti-union nature of the Southern economic model, and stating as one of the reasons for it being anti-union is the fact that unionism and unionization can really break down some of the racial and other hierarchies that exist in the South. And one of my favorite anecdotes that I have been talking about as soon as I read it in a book about the Alabama Coal Miners Union was about how the United Mine Workers in Birmingham fought back against the implementation of Jim Crow in the Birmingham Labor Council in 1901, in the same year that Alabama, the Redeemers got into power, rewrote the Alabama state constitution to institute constitutionally white supremacy, disenfranchise black folks. In the same year that happened, the Birmingham Labor Council said, we're not going to have black folks in our union halls anymore. And the mine workers said, if you do that, we're going to disaffiliate. And lo and behold, the Birmingham Labor Council disposed with the attempt to implement that policy. The United Mine Workers stayed affiliated with the Birmingham Labor Council. And, just the fact that they were able to do that in 1901 is really a testament to how those barriers can be broken down by unionization. And it's a really, heartwarming story of an illustration of that idea.
No, absolutely. That's exactly it. The minute when unions begin to realize, the only way for unions to maintain power, you couldn't have workers divided into groups along race. You needed to bring everyone together. That is the only way that you really are going to get worker power for the workers themselves.
Right. And so I guess talk a little bit about the fact that a lot of these policies are kind of rooted in racism. I mean, they've been these policies, the low taxation, little regulation, generous subsidies for businesses, at this point, these policies are kind of abstracted, and there was actually a conservative political strategist talking about how you take the steps from blatant bigotry to these kind of abstract concepts, but the ultimate result of them is that they hurt black people worse, they hurt poor white people worse, and so but talk to us about the real blatant roots of these policies. Where do they come from?
So I'll use two examples to kind of illustrate here. So one, after the end of slavery, when slavery, unless you were convicted of a crime, was no longer legal, Well, they still needed access to Black labor, and they still did not want to pay for that access to Black labor. And so you see this range of policies, from having laws on the books that say it's illegal to be idle. Now, these are only enforced against Black men and women. So white women were able to stay home if their husbands could support them. Black women could not. And so if you couldn't prove that you had a job, then they could take you, arrest you, and then hire you out. You were limited to jobs, pretty much the same jobs that you were doing during slavery. So they would have sharecropping. Black women could engage in domestic work in white homes. And again, you really didn't have any power to ensure that you were paid. Sharecroppers, you're doing exactly what you were doing before, except they're taking a share of what you're producing. So you see it being promoted, that it's the same, you're doing the same job, you're still not receiving compensation. You see arrests of people and then them being hired out to companies. So that's one when we talk about, like, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which put protections in for workers. They made sure to exclude domestic workers, agricultural workers, tipped workers. These were jobs that predominantly were done by Black men and women in the South. Tipping, that's another great example. The Pullman Car Company, it was, okay, well, there's all of these Black people that don't have jobs. They can work as maids, they can work as porters on the Pullman cars. And if they do their jobs well, they can ask to be provided a small tip from the people that they're serving. Again, it's a way of getting their labor without having to pay them. Another great example is taxation. One of my favorite quotes is, we are looking for the roots of our attitudes toward taxes in Boston when we should be looking in South Carolina. After the end of slavery, much of the money that the state got from property taxes on enslaved people, well, that goes away. So now property taxes are rising, and so wealthy plantation owners are able to then get poorer whites to say, like, look, they're taxing you more. And some Black people were able to get elected after the end of slavery. And so they're like, they're spending your money. We're just concerned taxpayers. We just want to make sure our taxes are being spent properly. And this creates a wedge between poor whites and Blacks. And so that's really the source of that, is that they were raising taxes, because this is after the war. So they need to, build infrastructure, education, healthcare. And so wealthier plantation owners were able to divide poor whites and Blacks by pointing to taxes and using that as a wedge between them.
Right. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. And when you look at these policies that are still being advocated today, I mean, literally the exact same policies, but if you go back and take a look at when they were implemented, the people who implemented these policies were not shy about the fact that, oh, I'm doing this because I'm super racist. I don't like Black people, and that's why I'm doing this. And another one of those is right to work. And that's one of the really preeminent anti-union laws across the country, and particularly in the South. And one of the first thing that right-wing forces implement when they get into power, when they consolidate power in state governments, and they would try to do it on a nationwide scale if they could. They've already done it on a nationwide scale in the federal sector. But people don't think about right to work as racist. They just think about it as I don't have to pay union dues if I don't want, right? What's racist about that, Chandra?
Well, again, the point of this, if you're thinking about who's unionizing, first of all, unions are the first line that, like I said, unions recognize that you have to bring Black and white people and Hispanic, everyone has to be brought together. You can't divide people. So that undermines that racial hierarchy to begin with. They also ensure, that they raise wages. They empower workers so workers get better wages, they get better benefits. They ensure that Black and white workers are paid the same because, you know, you've got this due process piece of it where they can't just arbitrarily fire Black and brown workers. So all of this undermines the Southern economic development model because it raises wages, it gets rid of that racial hierarchy, it gives workers power in the workplace. And it puts Black and white workers on equal footing, which undermines that. And so right to work is a way to basically to destroy unions. It's starving the union of the resources that it needs to be able to advocate on behalf of all workers by saying you have to represent everyone, but they don't have to pay any dues. But a real power of unions also is they educate their workers. They talk to their workers about the issues, they get them civically engaged and activated, and that also they really don't want, especially in these Black and brown communities across the South.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that they did that you mentioned in your report, in the pushing to implement these laws, you know, at this point, when people are trying to implement new right to work laws, they don't even push it as we want to take power from the unions. They're just saying, oh, you know, we want to just empower the individual workers. We're about individualism, not collectivism. That's kind of how abstract it's gotten. But when the right to work was implemented following Taft-Hartley, as that policy was made legal, explicitly they were saying, we're doing this to disempower unions because in unions, they're going to make your white daughters call a Black man brother, and we don't want that. And it's really amazing when you go back and look at the history of these policies, just how explicit the racism was, and how deeply rooted that kind of anti-solidaristic, those anti-solidaristic notions were. And so the, I guess, what about the little regulations? You know, we've talked about some of the roots of the policies of, you know, anti-unionism, of low taxes, but what about the lack of regulation? What are those roots in?
When we look at regulations, like one of the things I talk about in the report is in Louisiana and stretches of Texas. We'll stick with the Louisiana piece. So you've got areas that are where disproportionately Black and brown people, this specific example I'm giving is Black, it's a Black community, it's where Black people live, but they recoded as industrial so that industry can come in, which pollutes the air, pollutes the water, pollutes the land. It leads to cancer, it leads to increased incidences of lots of deadly diseases. But again, they're not going to regulate that. They're actually, like I say, they relabel the area industrial to allow them to come in because the lives of the people that live there are not valued. They are so devalued. And so they can come in and they're not regulated at all. And we see that in other industries where you see a lot of these companies relocating, especially to rural areas with large Black populations, and they're hiring workers, but they're not regulated. They're not making sure that they're safe. They're not making sure that they're being paid properly. That's another thing, wage theft. So they're not only not regulating them in terms of polluting the air, they're not regulating, making sure they're paying workers according to federal law, that they're not, they're also, we've seen this rollback of requiring, for example, for workers that are working out in the heat, of requiring them to have a break, to be able to get water, to be able to cool down. And there are debts that are associated with working out in the heat. And we're seeing this rollback of these requirements on companies. But we also know that these are predominantly Black and brown people that are in these jobs.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. Well, okay, so, you know, we've talked about some of the just kind of laying out and as we lay it out, you know, lower wages, less regulation, less taxes, anti-unionism, generous subsidies for businesses. You know, I mean, laying that out, that the proponents wouldn't even disagree with it. They would say like, oh, maybe the people who wanted these policies were racist before, but they just, we're not racist. We just happen to have all the same policies. But what have the results been? What we can, this has been the economic development model of the South for decades now. And so there's a certain extent to which we can just kind of factually take a look and say, how is this working for working people and for the communities and even for the businesses?
Yeah, so one thing I would say, and I know in the original report, I used the word low taxes too, and that's the wrong term. It's regressive taxes. It's not low taxes. So what that means is they're low personal and corporate income taxes. But what that means is that they then rely more on sales taxes and fines and fees, which means that poor people who are disproportionately Black and brown, but all low income people, are paying more of their incomes in taxes than wealthier people who could afford it.
Right.
So they still have to find money to fund government. It's just more of it is coming from sales taxes, from fines and fees. And we know those are just, the fines and fees are disproportionately in Black and brown communities. And so what we see with this system in place, and you're right, they presented as, no, we're just business friendly. And this business friendly model will lead to more jobs. It's going to lead to high job growth. It's going to lead to broad prosperity, the rising tide that lifts all boats.
Right.
But when we look at the data, what we see is, one, it was never intended to be a rising tide that lifts all boats. If you keep wages at $7.25 since 2009, you're not trying to ensure prosperity for anyone except those business owners, the wealthy few. But what we see is, first of all, job growth. What they tout as high job growth, when we look at the data, it's just population growth. The population of the region has increased. Air conditioning has made it more comfortable. You've got immigration into the country. And so it's not job growth. Actually, job growth lags population growth. It can't even keep up with population growth. Whereas in regions like in the Northeast, job growth exceeds population. So you can see it's creating jobs faster. We see they have a lower GDP per capita. The GDP is lower in the South, in states across the South, than in states outside the South. What we see is that wages are definitely lower. And while some will argue, well, the cost of living is cheaper, we adjusted those wages for the differences in the cost of living. Their wages are still lower. And more importantly, the wages are too low for what is needed to be able to live. So it's not just saying, are your wages lower than in another region? It's, will your wages afford you to be able to provide housing, provide transportation, to be able to get childcare, to be able to buy food, to be able to clothe yourself? Will it allow you to take care of your basic needs? And it does not. We have a family budget calculator that shows it does not allow families to meet their basic needs. What we do see is higher rates of poverty and higher rates of child poverty. So in some states like Mississippi, 1 in 4 children live below the poverty line. So we're seeing high rates of poverty, much higher than in regions outside the South. You've got lower employment to population. One thing we often hear about is how the South has lower unemployment rates. What people miss about that is that the unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for work. It does not include people who have not been able to find a job, and so they've given up, or they can't take a job because they don't have childcare, or they live in a rural area and there are no jobs near them, and they don't have good public transportation to get to where the jobs are. Those people don't get counted as unemployed. So it looks like they have a lower unemployment rate. What we do is we look at the prime age employment to population. What share of the prime age population has a job? And it's lower in the South than in regions outside the South. So that lower employment rate tells you that they're not able to create enough jobs to keep up with population. That's also part of it. It's just there's not enough jobs, so people don't have work, and so they give up. And one last thing I would say is, also criminalization. The South has rates of incarceration that are higher than many countries So the incarceration rate, that also makes it, one, those who are incarcerated are put to work either for the state and sometimes in private businesses, and they are not paid, or they're paid very low wages. So again, it's a reproduction of the system under slavery is what we're seeing there. And
Right.
once they are released from prison, that makes it even more difficult for them to find a job. And so
Exactly.
all of this together, I mean, you're creating this system where people can't escape that under this model. And that is by design.
Mm, mm. Some of the most striking statistics that you said there, I want to go back over them and kind of underline and italicize and bold, because some of these are particularly the real selling points of the Southern economic development model, and particularly unemployment, right? And so one of the, among the many things, one of their arguments against the minimum wage, against having a higher minimum wage, is that, if you have a higher minimum wage, you are going to price out some of the lowest skill workers. And they, if you set the minimum wage at $10 an hour, then somebody who only produces $8 an hour worth of value is they're just not going to get a job, whereas they would have had a job before. And so therefore you're going to have higher unemployment. And the implication would be that you also have a higher have a lower labor force participation rate. But this statistic about the share of prime age workers, so that's 25 to 54 is what the economist people have defined as prime working age, right? And that accounts for people who are in college. You're not accounting for low employment rates of people who are in school still, or even getting graduate degrees. You're 25. Most people by 25, you are squarely in the workforce. If you're going to be working, you are working by 25, right? And it's also not accounting for people who are 55 and older, who are, some of these people, in this economy of retiring at 55, that's, pretty lucky people. But, there are some people that are doing that. So we're not counting for that. We're accounting for the prime working age, 25 to 54. These are when people are working. And the share of prime age workers who have a job is lower than the national average in most southern states. That is astounding.
Yes, it is. I mean, and that's exactly, it belies the whole argument from their model. And what you've just laid out perfectly. It's leaving so many people behind, but that's not the statistic most people are looking at. Most are looking at that unemployment rate.
Right. Another one was the failure of job growth to keep up with population growth. This is another one, and they point to the unemployment rate, and Alabama has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. That doesn't count, but there has been a lot of consternation about the labor force participation rate. How can we get it up? That's been a big topic of conversation among Republican electeds for the last couple of years, and this job growth. That's another one. You would think, and they say things that would make you think that there are more jobs coming to the South because of our low, our business-friendly environment. Because we are so friendly to businesses, they're going to send more jobs here. And yet, job growth has failed to keep up with population growth, especially, that's since 2001, but especially since 2008. And that is in contrast to, the Yankee libs pro-union in the Northeast, that every bad, stereotype that Southern economic and political leaders have would be applied to the Northeast. And yet, the Northeast, since 2001 and 2008, has had higher job growth than population growth, as opposed to the South. I mean, that's just totally the opposite of what they would expect you to believe. I mean, it's really astounding. And then again, the third one, 9 of the 15 states with the lowest per worker GDP are in the South. So how much value are you creating per worker? 9 of the 15 lowest are in the South. And so, all of those are basically on their own terms. They are failing, and failing basically as hard as you can fail. And so why does the Economic Policy Institute, what is your theory for why that is? Why is it that on their own terms, the Southern economic development model fails?
Well, it fails workers and it fails families. Again, because it was never intended to uplift families. The Southern economic development model, as I said at the beginning, it developed out of efforts to continue gaining access to the labor of Black men and women without having to pay them adequately. It was never about uplifting that workforce and making sure that they rose with the tide. And so you've got in place policies. One of the characteristics of this model I didn't mention is this weak safety net. Again, it's intended to create a sense of desperation, to force you into the labor market. But again, if there's not enough jobs that are being created for you to have a job, but that's not their concern. Their goal is to extract as much labor from the labor force of the South. And again, today, this is poor whites, brown, Black, it's all low-wage workers are at the mercy of this model. But the point of that is not, if they really wanted to increase labor force participation, there would be childcare, there would be transportation that would facilitate people being able to get to work. There would be the supports that were necessary. There would be higher wages to ensure that workers, if you don't want a strong safety net, ensure that workers' wages will allow them to cover the costs that are necessary for them to participate in the labor market. So if that was the goal, then you would have these policies that would actually support workers being able to get to work, to afford to care for their families, afford to provide childcare, that they had the things like that they needed to be able to care for themselves and their families and keep them healthy, keep them educated, which would make them more productive workers.
Right.
That's exactly right. The idea that the reason that they keep the safety net so low is ostensibly so that lazy bums are not they're not sucking at the teat of the government and just laying around and not doing anything, again ostensibly like they do in California or New York, despite the fact that actually more workers who are in the prime working age have a job in those states. And so that really kind of belies the fact that, even if you kind of acquiesce and say like maybe it makes some kind of common sense understanding, that's just not what we see in reality. And basically the idea from, that you would be putting forward is that the sticks to get people into the labor force, the desperation and all of these as mechanisms to push people into the labor force are not as effective at getting people to be able to work as carrots or as removing obstacles that exist, right? Because no matter how much, how desperate you make people who don't have a job, if somebody has a disability and they're just not able to work unless they get accommodations, then they're just not going to be able to work. And so you have to remove those obstacles. And so the theory from the Economic Policy Institute is that if you remove those obstacles, if you have more carrots, if you make it easier to work, if you make it more lucrative to work, then people will work.
Yes, absolutely. First, yes, that's absolutely how that works. That higher wages, I'll take those as the carrots. Those are things, yes, when wages go up, when benefits, when I'm able, okay, I can take this job because it'll allow me to provide for my family, provide for our needs. I also will have the freedom to be able to take off when I need to go to my kids' school. I can take care of my ailing mom or aunt or whatever. But also, again, that obstacle piece, a lot of times, it's not even like they're willing to work, but if you're in a large rural area, a lot of times jobs are not located where there's large groups of people who need the jobs. They're not located in those same places. Well, you need to be able to get there. I grew up in Texas. I used to wait tables at IHOP for $2.13 an hour plus tips. And this was decades ago. And that's still the wage that a tipped worker is making throughout the region.
That's what I made in 2018 when I was waiting tables. It's $2.13 an hour.
Well, and for me, this was way longer back before then. My son is now in his 30s, and so this was much. But the thing is, I would get off work at like 6 in the morning. I worked the graveyard shift. The first bus did not come till 7 something. So I had to sit out in the dark for over an hour waiting on a bus. That is not, and this was not the best neighborhood where the restaurant was located. So these are things that like people need. If you need to get to work, if there's not a bus, if you needed to be there at 6 to relieve me, there's no bus to get you there.
Right.
Like
Right.
people need these resources to be able to get to work. And that wasn't even a rural community. This was in a city. So
Right. And so, Chandra, what would we talked about some of the things that would make things better, that would actually increase the labor force participation rate, as has been shown in other parts of the country and in other countries in the world. And so, what are some steps that you would recommend state leaders in Alabama and in states across the South begin to take to actually turn some of these problems around?
there's a phrase I ran across as I was looking at some of the auto manufacturing jobs that are in Alabama, and people refer to the Alabama discount. So what we see are policymakers across the region. Not only are they're not just not passing laws to raise workers' wages to a living wage or provide, paid family and medical leave or ensure that workers have health insurance. They are actually using the lack of those things to try to lure businesses in. Hey, come here. You don't have to fairly pay our workers. We're not going to regulate you, but we're going to give you subsidies. We're going to allow you to abuse workers. We're not going to be watching closely to make sure that you're treating them, that they have a safe work environment. One of the things I did with this was I did a deep look into Waffle House, those workers that went on strike and demanding. One of the workers reported being sent out in a hurricane to get paper towels because the restaurant did not want to close. Those types of policies, those have to be changed. Workers' wages need to rise. But I think as a first step, if workers can form unions, if they stop fighting the unions and allow workers to unionize, that empowers workers to a great deal. And that allows them to improve the quality of their jobs. But the whole Southern economic development model, the low wages, because it's not just that employers don't want to pay workers adequate wages. They actually sued the federal government for trying to raise wages for workers for profit contractors. Right. We need to make sure that safety net is strengthened so that when people lose a job, for example, they are in a greater position of power to get a better quality job and not forced to just take anything that they can find. It needs to make sure that workers provide benefits. So we know that paid family leave, workers in many other states have that. Workers across the South lack these basic benefits. And that just goes with that safety net, unemployment insurance, having access to those resources to empower workers, letting them unionize so that that means getting rid of those right to work laws. So that they're empowered themselves. I think those are some of the basic steps toward beginning to improve the lives of workers and families. Because keep in mind, these workers have families. So part of the reason that child poverty rates are so high across the region is because even when families are working, their wages are so low and there's few resources for them.
Right. And you mentioned the fact that Southern attorneys general sued the Biden administration when they raised the minimum wage for federal contractors to $15 an hour. And we just talked about how yesterday a Texas judge stopped the Biden administration's Department of Labor from implementing the new overtime rules in the state of Texas. And those new overtime rules expanding overtime protections to people that make under $55,000 a year. So if you make under $55,000 a year, you must be given overtime for hours worked over 40 in a work week. And so, I mean, these people in the state of Texas saying that, if you make $45,000 a year, your employer should be able to exempt you from overtime laws because you make so much money. That's the theory there, is that you're making so much money you don't deserve to make more when they force you to work 50 and 60 hours a week. I mean, it's really, really absurd and insulting and gross and all of the horrible adjectives that you can think of to describe it. Chandra Childers, Senior Policy and Economic Analyst for the Economic Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
All right, folks, check out the Southern Economic Development Model, the report on that from the Economic Policy Institute. The title of the report is called Rooted. Isn't that right, Adam?
Rooted in Racism.
Rooted in Racism, the Southern Economic Development Model. Check it out. There's a lot more. There is a lot more numbers behind that we didn't talk about there, so make sure you check it out. Check it out. Rooted in Racism, the Southern Economic Development Model by the Economic Policy Institute. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. and we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.